This is the Vincast, Australia's premier wine audio podcast. If you're a regular listener of this podcast and you might be interested in seeing some of the content that I create, then why not come to the Intrepid Wino YouTube channel and watch some of my videos. Regularly, I have the pleasure of opening up Australian wines. Sometimes they might come from my own cellar, but quite often they are very generously donated by wine producers who might be interested in seeing what I think. And if you'd like to see what I think of your wine, please do get in contact with me because I'd be more than happy to. I also do other videos. More recently, I've actually posted a couple of videos of my intrepid winemaking experience in 2016, which I playfully called the Sangiovese Project because I bought a ton of Sangiovese grapes from the Heathcote region and I chronicled my winemaking journey. So if you'd be interested, please head to that Intrepid Wino YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button. Why not watch some videos, like some, and please do comment because, of course, as always, I love hearing from you. But please enjoy this week's episode of the Vincast. On episode 89 of the Vincast, I chat with Australian wine writer Jane Faulkner. She shares her background, her insights, and particularly talks about alternative varieties in Australia and Italian wine. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Gasbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and I've got my first wine writer guest for a while. Someone I've actually been trying to get onto the podcast pretty much as soon as I started it. Jane Faulkner, who is one of Australia's favourite wine writers with particular expertise in Italian wines and Italian grape varieties. Is someone I knew before I started, and she was one of the first people I got in contact with. But unfortunately, scheduling has not allowed it until this past week. So I was very, very excited to finally be able to sit down with her and get some insight into her background, particularly as a wine journalist. So please stick around to the end of the episode so you can find out how to get in contact with both of us to let us know what you thought. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Jane, I've finally got you here on the Vincast. Welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
James, thank you for having me, and I do apologise for being late. I'm, 3 years late?
I've
been on the road, not all over in 3 years.
You are very busy. You're out in the regions. You're running wine shows. So I'm grateful that I was able to tease you in with some De Bartoli wine, so you could come and join me. So
that was just
welcome.
A lovely added incentive, by the way. Thank you.
Jane, I typically start every episode of the podcast asking my guest if they can remember the first interaction they had with wine that made them think about it in a different way, that sort of set them on the path of dedicating themselves to wine.
I know you asked that question of everyone. And I'm aware of it, and I should come and go, oh, well, James, guess what? It was, it was that 61 Barolo, or wasn't it a 78 Latache? But I have to say, no, I actually can't remember one that said, that's it, that's the light bulb moment. And I think because I grew up with wine. I had a family who loved wine. So it was all around us as children. Not in a boozy context.
No. But
just,
it was the same thing with me. My parents, drank wine when I was young. And so it was always on the table.
Yeah.
At family dinners.
Indeed. And that's what it was like for me growing up, which is wonderful. And some really good wines too. I guess the light bulb moment came with writing, because that's what I do essentially. And as a journalist, I was writing a lot about food and a bit of wine. And then I thought, oh, yeah, okay, I can write. And I really love wine. I should combine those two together.
So how did you get interested in writing?
I have always been interested in writing since a kid.
Yeah.
And I went to uni to do a degree, an arts degree initially.
Sure.
But I always wanted to write. Now, having said that, I'm not talking about writing novels.
No.
I've always been interested in journalism, and I applied for a cadetship, which was what they were called back then.
So non-fiction was very much, journalism was the
absolutely.
interest.
Very exciting.
Interesting. Okay. So you got interested in that form of writing, like as far as reading it when you were younger?
Yeah, reading the paper. I love interviews and I love reading them, and I still do. I love interviewing people and I love writing their story.
Sure.
I'm just the conduit for that.
So when you studied journalism, did you have a particular area that you might have been interested in at that point, or you just sort of thought, I'd want to do journalism and I'll see where it takes me?
Yeah, exactly. When you train at a newspaper, you sort of do everything, all sorts of areas that you work into. I was obsessed at one stage about police writing, police reporting, court reporting, loved it, and specialised in that for many years. But, it's the art of the interview, and it's trying to pull out and tease out those kind of questions from people and get the answer. And I love it that often it's, when you think, oh, gee, this interview is going really, really not so well. And then you're about to leave and they say that one thing and you go, gold. Yeah. It's that one moment. It's your link that brings it all together. I love that. And it happens with winemakers or producers, growers. Love it.
So what was your first journo gig?
Well, I worked at the time. I got a cadetship at the Sun News Pictorial. So there you go, which actually was a brilliant training ground. Yeah, met great journos. Look, once you're in somewhere, people move around, and it's like this community. It's a bit like sommeliers. It's a bit like winemakers. Yeah. It's a real community. Yeah. But I chose the print word. I love that. I've done a bit of radio and television, but it's far more interesting for me to write. I just adore that.
Yeah, like the research element as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Love that.
Did you have some early mentors in those days?
Look...
Or was it just sort of everything influenced you?
Yeah, that's right. And obviously they were great, journalists at the paper, and then I went on later on to work at The Age after a period of time doing some other things. And they were great writers there, great editors. So they're always an inspiration.
And were you interested in food and wine at this stage, just purely from a
Yep, I was
not quite a hobby, but just a lifestyle kind of thing?
Yeah, when I applied for my cadetship, because you've actually got to go and do an interview as well. Yeah. They don't sort of look at, she's been to uni, she's done this. Yeah, you do an interview. Yeah, and I was sitting there, and I remember because at the time it was the Herald and the Sun; they were two separate papers. And I looked around this boardroom. I was the last one. I purposely made sure I was the last person to be interviewed, cadet for the day, potential cadet. And there were all these old fogies, blokes, doing the interview. They would look really tired. And one of them I connected with, and he was the editor at the time of The Sun. And he said, look, why do you want to be a journalist? And I said, I want Eric Page's job, who at the time was a leading restaurant reviewer. And I said that cheekily. I said, I want to work with him and I want to write about wine. And that was it. And a couple of weeks later, they rang up and said, you've got the job. Not to be a restaurant reviewer.
So they appreciated your moxie.
Yeah, there you go. So anyway, it worked.
Yeah, okay. So you had the opportunity to work across a number of different kind of desks, as it were, as a journo.
Exactly.
How long did it take to sort of start to look at writing as far as food and wine?
Look, that did take longer because I really loved just getting into the scene. Once you're there, it's like... And this is, when people talk about you have ink in your blood, wine in your blood. I really did get excited about being in a newsroom. It's one of the most exciting places to work. Yeah. It's like vintage every day. Yeah. And I just was immersed in that. And I was young, I was only in my early 20s. So I was into that, still drinking great wine, but that was just what I did. I loved it. When I say great wine, it wasn't that expensive. I was on a cadet's wage and it wasn't very much back then, I can tell you. That came later when there was just an opportunity. Life is about timing. And there was an opportunity when I worked at The Age. I was doing some restaurant reviews for the Good Food Guide and Cheap Eats, and I edited Cheap Eats. And then a section came up and they needed a wine writer. And obviously, it was more than a hobby, I guess, wine. I was into it. It was a bit geeky in that sense. and it just fitted.
Did you find yourself reading about it
Yeah.
extracurricularly?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Reading about it. But the best experience, if you can't actually be in the place where the wine comes from, is just actually the bottle.
Sure.
Tasting wine is the most fabulous experience. If you have a beautiful bottle, now we've just tasted 2 wines, the Marco de Bartoli wines, the Vigna Verde and the Solavento. Now, okay, even if you hadn't been to Sicily, perhaps you've never tried these grape varieties before, they immediately take you somewhere and you go, what's that about? What's that flavour? I've never had anything like that. I find that thrilling. And that's why, bringing words with wine together makes it so beautiful, because you're trying to impart that information to people. They may not get on my journey or bandwagon, but I hope that people also think about that. That's what it's really about. So I can get a bottle of wine and be completely transported, and then I'll go, okay, what's that about? And then you start investigating it a bit more, researching. Then you find out, wow, this producer's amazing. Look at the story behind that producer. And really, it's always the story, no matter what. And that's the whole thing.
Yeah. So up until that point, had you, on the subject of travel, had you done much travel, like whether it was for work or whether it was just sort of travel for your own enjoyment?
Yes, certainly in my late 20s, I did a fair bit of travel. Obviously, initially, you go to Asia a lot, so the food's great. Not really wine in terms of the heat. I actually grew up in Malaysia, so
really?
I'm just used to drinking. Well, not as well. Actually, I probably did have a few Kingfisher beers and Tiger beers there, and so there's always that food and wine component, or having a drink with your food.
Yeah,
and obviously Europe being certainly Italy, France, Germany, well, all the European countries have that kind of food and wine culture down pat, because they've been matching those wines in a particular region for, hundreds, if not thousands of years. I love that. And when I went to Paris, I have to say, that's where sort of the fine dining thing came in. You'd go to a beautiful restaurant, Alain Ducasse, when he opened his first restaurant, I spent almost all my pay packet of about a month dining there, and it was the first time I came across white truffles, which obviously come from Piemonte, but he brought them in.
Sure.
And this was in, I don't know, the mid-90s, and the great wine list there. And they said, oh, you should, try it. They actually had a Barolo. Unfortunately, I can't remember what it was, which is a bit silly, isn't it? And I just thought, what is this? And that certainly was a light bulb moment, but it was the combination of the two and those heady aromas of both. And it just, wow. But, travel does that to you, doesn't it? You go somewhere and you go, wow, what's this about? Leads you on that journey. You get another story. So I'm just building volumes up.
So you relish that opportunity to kind of explore as far as culinary and vinologically. Sorry, I don't know what.
That's a great made-up word, vinologically. Maybe there is. That sounds fabulous. I'm going to use that. Do you mind?
No, please be my guest. Whilst you were traveling in Europe, it wasn't, because it was the same thing with myself when I, in again my late 20s, when I spent a year traveling around Europe. The primary reason was to learn about wine, and I wanted to experience regional cuisine as well. But I also took an opportunity to sort of pursue cultural experiences, like going to galleries, that kind of thing. And so when you travelled in Europe, did you sort of do the same thing?
Sure, but so did you do this when you left King and Godfrey?
Yes.
Well, you worked in a great wine shop, so you had that kind of foundation there. So that sort of is a lovely springboard, isn't it? And I guess, look, for me, I'm doing an arts degree, loving words. I read a lot, and there's that sort of kickstarts things for you. So yes, you would go to a region, and initially I did a lot of trips to France, and you get to look at the food of a region. Obviously, Burgundy has particular food, and funnily enough, great wine.
Yeah.
A la Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and things start to fall into place.
Yeah.
And I love that.
Yeah.
And you visit, there might be a local art gallery, or you speak to someone who lives there, and they're just, I don't know, those connections that make sense.
A place of historical significance as well, yeah.
Indeed, yeah. It's all part of it. Culture is the right word for it.
at this stage, were you doing any writing on your own, like for yourself? Like
No, not really. Not
not
as
journaling
such.
or anything like that?
No, this is pre-blogging, pre-everything. Gosh, I miss those days. It was so much simpler. You think, God,
Before Twitter and after Twitter?
Yeah, well, it's so true. I know, I sound like a dinosaur, don't I? Anyway, it was, look, you worked and you were so busy at work that your free time was your travel time. But regardless, I would always take notes. I've still got notebooks filled from times before I actually started writing about wine. I have notes in books about wine that I've had when I was on these trips, because they're like really important things to remember. I can't remember things, and so I've got to write them down, or take a photo of the wine list before your mobile phone was like it is today. And, you keep a diary about them. And I look back and go, oh, gosh, I did taste that wine. How amazing.
Yeah.
So I love that. And occasionally I bring them out, although I've got a lot of rubbish I've got to get through now. It's good to upload all that stuff onto your computer so you can get rid of all the paperwork.
Yeah, absolutely. So you started writing about wine. What was wine writing like back in the? Sorry,
not that long ago.
It wasn't that long ago. I know. I feel like I'm saying like the 1950s or something. No,
yeah. Oh no, I wasn't even born then. I might look it, but heavens.
Oh goodness.
Look,
Not
wine
true.
writing is a funny little thing at the moment, isn't it? Back then, I started on the age writing about wine. At that time, in the 90s, it was a pretty healthy place, or late 90s, whatever it was, for journalism generally.
Right.
Certainly Fairfax is not the paper, the Sydney Morning Herald as well, is not the paper that it is today, what it was then. And I'm not trying to be, bitter and twisted. It's just, it's a different era.
Yeah.
And I actually like this era, and I'll talk about that in a minute, because I think wine writing was a bit... look, I did a column in a section called A3 that's now defunct, and I did an interview with a producer normally, and wrote some tasting notes about that producer. And you tried to connect the tasting note to the story, and I really enjoy that. I think a lot of wine writing can be boring. It was a bit boring back then, although there was some great, as in tasting notes, they're pretty boring, I think, a lot of the time.
I mean, if you take away the fact that they're also completely subjective,
of course, absolutely,
and that's the criticism that's laid at tasting notes a lot of the time, is that they're also, there's no connection. Like, someone might read it and go, "Well, I don't really know what that means."
Yeah, if someone says, "Oh, I don't really know what that means," then that person who's writing it isn't conveying the message very well.
Yeah.
I have no problem with anyone being subjective. In fact, I would prefer someone to say, "Oh, gee, Jane Faulkner really loves that wine. Can't you tell by the words, and that she gave it a good score?"
And she's saying why she enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's fair enough, because it's, I have a response to a wine always, and it might not be a positive one all the time, but I want to convey the message to say, look, this wine is just there's a tasting note. If you like how I write, great. If you don't, doesn't matter. Plenty of others. A tasting note is just that, and we shouldn't worry about it too much. That's only a small part of wine writing. Wine writing is also about the stories behind a bottle.
Yeah.
The producers. I'm far more interested in interviewing producers than... I love tasting wine, I have to say. And often I'll find a producer because I've tasted a wine, know nothing about it, and you go, wow, what's this all about? And then off you go on your journey and you find out, oh, wow, that person's amazing.
But the experience is so much more enriching when it's put in context. So if there's context around the experience of just tasting the wine, I think that there's so much more, you connect with it so much more. And I think that's, the benefit of meeting with a winemaker, or going to the vineyard, or having it with food, or having it with certain people.
Yep. I agree.
That's what it's all about. So that was kind of what you were really trying. So I guess people liked seeing tasting notes. It's like that bottle, this vintage of this wine, it costs this much. I can go buy it there. That's great. But then to actually have that kind of connection with your sort of profile of the producer.
Yeah, well, I find that far more interesting.
Sure.
The other side is there's so much wine around to actually. build up a database and a memory bank and a taste palette.
Yeah.
You've got to taste a lot. And look, sometimes it's just a tasting note because you go, oh, well, that's it. It might be a perfectly good wine, no problem. But it's like I'm just not following that producer up at the moment because, I've got another 5,000 bottles to get through. Mm-hmm. So, it depends. There's some fantastic wines out there, but I would perhaps choose a producer that, for example, I love speaking to, I don't know why he's just popped into my head, John Werdekin from Pheasants.
John Werdeman, yeah.
Werdeman.
Former guest of the podcast.
Yes, I do know that. What an amazing guy.
Yeah.
And
so interesting.
Charming man, incredible story that, he's a musician, goes to Georgia, falls in love with a Georgian girl, loves the country, wants to make wine, and is making beautiful wine. Yeah. And wow, what a story. Now, if the wines didn't match, like if the wines were pretty ordinary, you go, oh, great guy.
Sure.
Gee, the wines aren't so good. That would be problematic, wouldn't it? So you'd probably move on. But because the wines are really good, I just think that ticks every box in my...
But at the same time, you could taste the wine and go, oh, that's quite delicious.
Yeah.
I don't know anything else about it. But knowing the story and knowing how important he is to kind of really invigorate the whole Georgian wine industry, and the fact that he's an artist as well, just makes you go, like, you sort of taste more. I think it's so much more of an experience. You sort of feel like it's a soulful experience, tasting his wines.
Very much so, but that's the added bonus by investigating it,
Exactly.
digging deeper. I mean, if you're going to look at those wines, you go, okay, for the red variety, say Saperavi, well, it's not being drunk a lot in Australia, so you'd have to be interested and go, Saperavi, what's this about?
Yeah.
And then the story unfurls, and obviously the whites that he produces, you'd be sucked in by that.
Absolutely.
Just from a curiosity level, you hope you would then go to the next step and go, what is this about?
Was there a point where you started to notice yourself getting interested in particular types of wines, like wines from a certain country or wines of a certain variety, that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. Definitely Italian wines. Obviously, I have a great love of...
There's a reason why I've wanted to have you on, because I'm like you. I am completely seduced by Italian grapes and Italian wines.
Yeah, and this is definitely from travelling, because even though there were some okay Italian wines in Australia, say when I started drinking properly in the 80s and 90s, they were sort of the top end wines, and they looked really, some of them weren't that interesting overall, and they were quite expensive. But it was when I did travel and you got exposed to, wow, it's not just Sangiovese. There are so many great varieties in Italy. It's astonishing. And it just opens up another world for you. And the other thing I often talk about in particular with Italy is the savouriness of their wines, which Australians now love. It's taken a while.
Yeah.
They're not fruit bombs. And I love that savoury line, the acid profile, the tannin profile. And obviously I love Nebbiolo a lot because I spend a lot of time in Piemonte, but not only Nebbiolo. I love Barbera, I love Dolcetto, Arneus and, Timorasso, one of my favourite grape varieties.
Yeah.
So special wines.
So at a certain point you were sort of thought of, like you started to be thought of as the kind of the person to go to as far as Italian wines and Italian varieties being worked with in Australia.
I don't know if I'm the only person.
No, not the only, but I think that you are still sort of front of mind in that kind of aspect.
Sure. Oh, well, that's nice to hear. I guess the other thing is I've chaired the Australian Alternative Varieties Wine Show for a number of years now and judged several times beforehand when Max Allen was the chair. Obviously, it's not just Italian grape varieties there, but that obviously spurred an interest as well. And look, I travel to Italy once or twice a year. I make the effort to go. You have to do that. I think it's really hard to specialise in anything if you're not immersed in the culture in the region, talking to those producers in situ, going to the vineyards and hearing all about it. You really have to understand why the sun shines at a particular spot at a particular time of day. The southwest vineyards or southeast in Piemonte, the hills, it just falls into place. And thing about expert's a funny word because I will never be an expert because you're constantly learning something. And every time I go back, oh, right, I get that now. And it's just, you're just adding another layer of expertise, I guess, is the thing. And meeting new producers, that's the other great thing. You're constantly seeing young crews coming through. Now you've got Dave Fletcher, who's an Aussie winemaker, obsessed by Nebbiolo, and now he lives there.
Yeah.
And he bought the old Barbaresco train station, which is being refurbished into his winery. He also is a winemaker at Ceretto. And, knowing that is just great. So I guess connections again. But connections, story, timing.
Yeah, absolutely. The Vincast is a proud supporter of Australian wine and also Australian wine communication, and it is supported in part by Wine Companion, also known as Halliday Magazine. If you haven't heard of James Halliday, he is an iconic Australian wine writer and educator, and he actually launched an annual guide on Australian wines, which evolved into a regular magazine about wine, now called Halliday, and has a huge repository of information about Australian wine on the Wine Companion website. You can find information about wine producers, particular wines, different vintages in each region, and lots of wonderful articles written by some of Australia's best writers. So if you go to the Wine Companion website and you investigate some of their different subscription packages, please don't forget that if you'd like to subscribe, use the special code Intrepid30 to get a fantastic 30% discount on any subscription package, which is a way of supporting the podcast and supporting great wine communication. And another probably well-known example of an Australian winemaker in Italy would be Anna Martins, another former guest of the podcast. Who's
You're
making some
famous,
amazing, who's making some amazing wines on Etna. And so I think there's a lot of interest of Australians, whether they're in the industry or not, to go and travel in Italy and and learn about the wines. So what are some of the places that you really love just returning to, and you would hope that everyone had the opportunity to go and visit, particularly as far as wine in Italy?
That's an easy and a hard question at the same time, because I could rattle off a number of producers.
Yeah.
Just depending on my mood, I guess. And not because the Marco de Bartoli wines really well, but because we just tried to today. If you went to Sicily and you didn't go to Marsala and try those wines, to me, I get goosebumps when I try his Marsala. His story is phenomenal. That they're now making beautiful table wines is a credit to his son, Sebastiano. I think it is.
Two sons and the daughter as well.
Okay. I've only met Sebastiano.
Yeah.
And just his story, I cried when I first heard about Marco de Bartoli and what the authorities did, because when he was making Marsala, true Marsala, i.e. not fortified, and the authorities, you don't put egg and all of this crap into it like the English want. It's not part of our law. So then they closed up his winery for 5 years.
Yeah.
I find that criminal. And when I heard that story, I cried. I just thought, no one deserves that, and they didn't have a right to do that, although they thought legally they did.
Yeah.
Anyway, and subsequently in 2011 he did die, but his legacy lives on, and I think stronger as a result. If you're not moved by going to that place, hearing that story, tasting his wonderful Vecchio wines, then the Marsala in particular, then I don't know. I just, and there are lots of stories like that.
Yeah.
There's one, Elio Altare, who's a Barolo producer. Now, a lot of people today might say, he uses too much new oak, this and that. Well, okay, maybe it's not your style, no problem. I love Messalino as well, who use larger format, beautiful wines. But Elio Altare, he had to lose his family, basically, as in his father, to follow his ideal of how to make a wine. Now, for better or worse, can you imagine being in a small town and your father no longer speaks to you because he doesn't believe you're treating, the Nebbiolo the way you should.
Yeah.
And his father, they never spoke again. And I find that, again, that's heartbreaking to hear that kind of story. So does that make the wine better for me, that story? Well, maybe not, but, I guess then that's the argument about tasting blind, because you can be so overwhelmed. But, wine is emotional, and so I'm not...
Yeah, and that kind of affection towards a person and their story can enriches experience. Like someone who I consider to be my wine guru is Damian Podversic.
Yep.
And he didn't speak with his father for, I think, like 10 or 15 years, because he wanted to follow a path of making quality wines. And so he wanted to get rid of vineyards and buy this old vineyard and bring it back to life, because he knew that site was amazing. He knew, like, the vines were old, and he wanted to, cut down yields, make less wine, but make absolutely amazing wine, because he was mentored by Josko Gravner. And his father said, "What are you doing? Like, money is made by making more wine." And he said, "No, I can make better wine." And he sacrificed, again, it's a question of people suffering for their passion and having this vision and sort of saying, "No, I have to follow this path because I know where it's going to take me." I think, that you find that's, I think Italy is a great place to find those kinds of stories.
Yeah, I don't think it's just Italy, by the way, because then, I love Portuguese wines too. And,
amazing.
What Dirk Neerport has done in terms of revolutionising table wines in Portugal is phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's another country who has, an astonishing array of other variety, or lots of varieties.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And their wine tradition, I think, is quite extraordinary as well, with the lagars. I was seduced by Portugal as well, I have to say. So you worked for a number of years for The Age.
Yes.
Post The Age, what have you sort of been working on yourself? Like, what have you've got something still coming at some point, possibly?
Oh, look, it's the bane of my existence. And if anyone listens to this, she's not going to talk about a website that isn't there. That is coming along. Actually, I've done a lot of work. But look, websites, they're a lot of work, and they've got to look fabulous. If you don't have them looking fabulous from the minute it's up, people are going to go, that looks half finished, or, that's not quite right, and you lose them. So I'd rather, take longer than expected, get it looking brilliant, and it's winematters.com.au. Eventually it'll get there. I am, and I'm nearly there. It's just got to be right. And also, even though it's starting out with an Australian base, there are articles and wine and tasting notes from wines from obviously Italy and elsewhere. And I'm also getting other people to write for it. I think that's a really important thing. A lot of websites, particularly in Australia, it's maybe the one person or just a couple, and I just find that's a bit repetitive. And when I was starting the website, I realised, there's something not right. I thought, it's me. There's too much of me, and I couldn't stand it. And I want to have other voices. I think that's really important.
In the same way that Jancis Robinson has people like Walter Speller.
Yes. Well, she is the guru. She's got a bit more money than I, but absolutely, because you've got specialists in an area.
Yeah.
They're on the ground.
Yeah.
I can't be in Germany. I'm not, I can't be in Italy every week. So you've got to get those people who are to say, can you write me a piece on that? This is happening. And that is going to happen.
And I guess that is kind of the great thing about communication now, because you can establish relationships, and then someone might be overseas. I might be working vintage over in Europe or in North America, and they might do a bit of travel, and them, whether it's in person or through social media or something like that. That they can actually string a sentence together, as Max Allen so eloquently put it, and you can say, look, whilst you're in Germany, why don't you write a piece for me and put it up on the website?
Yes. Look, the other thing is, it might come as a surprise to some, but not everyone can write.
No.
It is a craft. It's a skill. You've got to work at it. Now, having said that, there might be somebody, say, who's a winemaker, and you think, I'd love you to do, you've just done this vintage. I've heard your stories. can you write something? And then it's the job as the editor or sub-editor to sort of pull those words together to make it readable and interesting.
Yeah.
And this is the dilemma. And having been an editor, and I can tell you there's some pretty bad stuff out there.
Yeah.
And look, you know, you look at blogs. I mean, most of the blogs I look at, the writing is truly woeful.
Yeah.
And
just grammatically.
It's not just grammatically. It's not
just grammatically. But it is bad enough.
Yeah, it is. Look, if you care about words, yes.
Yeah.
And I remember, look, even years ago, a food writer, and I was editing copy, and I said something like, "Look, you know, just," and it's an awful thing to have to speak to someone and say, "Look, you know, this isn't looking so good. You need to tighten this up." And half the time they don't know. You know, it's not really their fault in one respect.
No.
They haven't been trained. And when I told this person about, you know, how perhaps to better craft those words to make them flow better, and said, look, there's some things that are not grammatical. And he said, well, that's how I write. And I said, you need to know grammar in order to break the rules. And then, you know, but to sort of just ignore it. And when people say to me, oh, I want to get into wine writing, I said, great, read lots of novels.
Yeah.
You have to read widely, not just the wine books, the great wine books, the Kermit Lynch books that are beautifully written. I mean, obviously there are some people who, you know, like Kermit, who could, I think it's his writing. Maybe he had a really good editor too. I don't know. But, you know, they're compelling stories, beautifully written. But everyone's work needs editing, and you have to practice your craft. You want to be good at wine tasting, you have to taste every day. It's practice.
Well, in the same way that winemakers can't just sort of have an interest in wine and go, I'm going to make a wine, they have to taste extensively.
A lot of them don't, do they?
No. Well,
surprising.
And I guess that was kind of the whole point of wine shows, was to actually train winemakers to kind of look objective, or as objectively as possible, at wines, to kind of assess the so-called quality of the wine, to, you know, as they would say, improve the breed of wine. And that, you know, that's that's a really important part of the Australian Alternative Varieties Wine Show that you are the chair of, particularly considering that these are grape varieties which in some cases haven't been in Australia for very long. They're not extensively produced, and so it's an opportunity for people who are making those kind of wines to get some feedback on the wines that they're producing, and sort of saying whether it's of quality, whether it's representative of the variety, whether it's representative of it being in Australia, but also to look at other examples being produced in Australia. And so,
sure,
I'm sure, you know, in the years that you've been chairing the show, you've seen the number of entrants increase every year.
Indeed. And just to step back, though, the wine show system in Australia started out with an agricultural system.
Yeah.
And it was about mostly men in white lab coats, being very technical, because they were all winemakers back then. Things have started to change maybe in the last 10 or so years. Having sommeliers, wine writers on board as well, which is a great thing, because, hey, they taste widely too, and they represent, the people who buy the wine, the happy drinker.
Sure.
So it's great to get winemakers out of that technical mould. Now, that's not to say that's, you know, it's a bit impartial, isn't it? It's a bit sterile to judge wine. You know, oh, yes, smells good, not faulty, move on, 80 points, 85 points or whatever. Yeah. I think that's an awful way to look at a wine. And I do have a big issue with wine shows, believe it or not, even though I chair a few of them. It is a false way to look at wine in one respect. Yeah. But it is the system that we have in terms of judging. I think judging these days is more about marketing than anything else. With the Alternative Varieties Wine Show, I do still think, and, you know, people might say, oh, you're biased, but I do still think that show is about a community. You're looking at grape varieties no one's grown before or unfamiliar with, and that's pretty exciting. Having said that, there are some varieties that have been around for a while, and, for example, Sangiovese has been in Australia 20 plus years, And look, some of the wines aren't particularly good. And you need to, the producers need to look at their cropping levels. They need to look at how they're making the wine. You need to taste wines from Italy, not because you can replicate that.
No.
You can't.
Not to say this is how it should be made.
Definitely. These are Aussie examples,
Yeah.
but maybe you're extracting too much. Maybe you're using too much oak.
Yeah.
You have to think about it beyond, this is a quick buck.
Yeah.
And that certainly happened
You mentioned marketing, and I think to a certain extent that, there is interest. There's, whether it's still sort of a niche part of the wine market in Australia, but there is interest, and so people can use the fact that it's Sangiovese on the label to sell their wine, because it's not Shiraz or Merlot.
Yeah. Exactly. And look, wine is about fashion a lot of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, top end is a bit different, and that's another category. I mean, I look at some of the lower price pointed wines and I just despair. There's just some bog ordinary stuff out there. And boy, it's great in terms of Australia because we make really good, clean wine. But, down at that level, it's pretty boring.
Yeah.
And, I want to... Again, not to impose my will on anyone, say, don't drink that. If you're drinking wine, good on you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, gee, if you just, how about this? There's so many other varieties out there other than Pinot Grigio or Pinot Gris that, we can't even decide which name to give it in Australia. But I guess the difference is we love wine, so we go that extra mile, don't we?
Yeah, of course.
We're obsessed by it, I guess, to an extent, and use that word that's been bandied about way too often, passionate, but it does get you, and you fall in love with it. But you know what? A lot of people out there, they just want to drink.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't like the kind of the assumption that people who are, in the industry, that they only drink expensive wine like that. Of course, I don't think people realize that it's not actually a great way to make money working in the wine industry.
We're broke, aren't we?
Exactly. Yeah. We're living from bottle to bottle. But it's, they probably need to see that there can be really interesting wine at, not expensive prices, but that's where I think the producers can probably sort of say, look, you don't actually need to do all this sort of stuff. You need to maybe a couple of things, and you can still make an inexpensive wine that, is very approachable, very enjoyable for people, but actually has some interest to it.
I agree. And when I've done, I do a bit of teaching. I teach Italian wine as well, but also introduction to wine, etc. The people are fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, I start with the most obvious question. Right, tell me what you drink. And we know when you do an intro course that they're going to say Sauvignon Blanc,
Sure.
Pinot Gris or Grigio. And look, boy, occasionally there might be someone who puts their hand up to Riesling, depending how old they are. Now, I always bring in different wines, really good wines, different varieties. Perhaps I start on a varietal mix, which, look, it's not a cop-out, but it just makes it easier to rein it in and then say, look, if you're excited about that wine, check out the producer, go forth. And when you put another wine in front of them, they are really good. They go, oh, gee, that's great.
Sure.
I've never had that before. It's delicious. It's refreshing. It's an Australian Vermentino,
Yeah, exactly.
and it's crisp and crunchy. Wow, I never knew that. And I think there's still that intimidation that comes with wine, which is silly. It should be so egalitarian, but boy, it ain't, is it?
No, yeah.
Because people, wine writers, sommeliers, we like to sometimes, you don't drink that, do you? And be a bit snobby about it. That shits me no end. I think it's ridiculous.
Absolutely.
So if you like Sauvignon Blanc, knock yourselves out, but there's other stuff to try. And even with the Sauvignon Blanc, for example, in New Zealand, which I actually think is a terrific drink, there are just too many of them that look a bit the same. But then you get some great ones with texture, and then putting, what Kevin Judd does with his wild...
the grey wacky stuff.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Not the only one. And it's about sort of teasing away that, okay, you do like Sauvignon Blanc, how about exploring something else? It's just sort of giving them a bit of an opportunity. But I have more time. I spend my life on wine. These people are just going to go out for dinner and have a great drink or something like that. But I would just love to think, just go that one step.
What I find is great is sort of finding out what people like, what kind of wines people enjoy drinking, and then finding a way for them to understand perhaps why they like that.
Yeah.
To then sort of say, oh, okay, so if I like this characteristic in these kinds of wines, and if I talk to a sommelier or a retailer, or if I read something written by a wine writer, and they talk about those characteristics in a different wine, then that can lead you on a different path. And so
Sure.
that's a way for you to
Yeah.
discover different wines. And then maybe you see a different characteristic in that wine that you connect with as well and go, oh, I like that too. And so it's just sort of like building blocks,
Yeah,
to take them up.
Yeah.
I think the kind of oh, you don't drink that. It comes from, it's a shame that you're missing opportunities to explore more. But I think it's such a slippery slope that it so quickly devolves into snobbery.
Yeah, of
which
course
is a shame.
it does. Yeah, and let's face it, not everyone finds wine as interesting as we do.
No, of course not.
We've got to keep that.
Most 99% of the people,
Yeah, that's right.
They just drink it for a reason, that they enjoy drinking it,
Yeah.
and they're not looking for much more.
No.
And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. If they want to learn more, fantastic. Absolutely. There's lots of things they can do. They can go to wine events, they can go and visit wineries,
Yeah.
they can read, they can talk with their, local independent retailer. That's the way people can get a little bit more out of it. And I hope that's what people will do more and more. And of course, following everything that you do is a fantastic way for people to explore something that they might not have known before.
Yeah, you hope so, and there are plenty of people out there. There's really good writing out there. It's about pointing them in the right direction,
Of course.
And just thinking, gosh, there is more to life than Sauvignon Blanc. No, I don't mean that. I actually do like Sauvignon Blanc, but look, I drink a lot of Chardonnay. I adore Chardonnay. So, when people say, "Oh, you love Italian wine, but you drink Chardonnay," yeah, hell yeah, particularly Australian Chardonnay. It's so exciting. But I've followed that journey as well. And it's just all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, it's obviously not all of a sudden, but when people still have this image, and I'm thinking back when I've done some wine courses recently teaching, that they go, "Oh no, I don't like Chardonnay." And I go, "Why?" "Well, I just don't like it." And they can't quite articulate it. So I just say, "Do you think it's, because it's too big and rich?" "Yes, that's it." Or,
Yeah.
And then you give them wine, you go, "Oh, and I pour them a wine. I may not tell them what it is. And they go, "Oh, I really like that." And I say, "You see, this is what happens. We become biased."
Sure.
And we're blinkered. We don't know why half the time. Maybe we heard something. Maybe someone embarrassed us at a wine tasting. Maybe a wine writer, said that wine is, not particularly good. Or maybe a sommelier said, "Oh, why are you ordering that?" I don't know.
Or at the same time, maybe they're told, "Well, that's what Chardonnay is." And they go,
Yes,
"Well, I don't
that's
like
right.
that.
Yeah.
Well, so therefore I don't like Chardonnay."
Yeah.
And they're completely unaware that there's a different style of Chardonnay that they might actually connect with. That's the reason why
Exactly.
they've gone to Sauvignon
Yeah.
Blanc. And then they can try these, very lithe, very brisk Chardonnays, like nice and crunchy. And they go, "I really like that. Oh, but it's Chardonnay. Oh, okay." And maybe it serves to confuse them a little bit more, but hopefully it makes them think, I need to possibly open up my horizons a little bit.
Yeah, I guess one of the words that really freaks me out in wine is homogeneity.
Yeah.
And so I think people drink Sauvignon Blanc, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc in particular, is because they know roughly what it's going to be.
Exactly.
And it's it's familiar and it's safe.
Sure.
Nothing wrong with that.
Sure.
But but not all Sauvignon Blanc is made like that.
No,
and so I think, unfortunately, there are some really good producers of Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand that suffer as a result of their New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. I know it sounds a bit contrary.
It does, yeah.
But and then when they're trying to make things a bit different, like, we mentioned grey wacky, and to build up texture and using some older barrels and using some lees contact and really build beautiful texture on Sauvignon Blanc. People go, "Oh, that's not Sauvignon Blanc." But yes, it is.
Yeah.
That try not to box everything and be open-minded. And that would be the only thing I would say to someone. Just try it. If you can't pronounce it, doesn't matter. Go for it. How did I learn? I learned by mistakes, by making a fool of myself, which I'm very good at.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't matter. And if you like something, if you taste it because someone's shown you, poured you a glass, if you like it, you will get better at enjoying other examples of it. It's a journey. There's a story. It's exciting.
Yeah.
Drink more.
Think of
Good
it as an
stuff.
opportunity.
That's right. Think of it as an opportunity.
Well, this has been a wonderful opportunity to have you on. And again, thank you so much for joining me on the Vincast, Jane. I'm sure that the listeners will get a lot out of our discussion today.
Thank you, James.
For people who aren't already across Jane Faulkner, what's the best way for them to follow you on social media, online, to keep in touch?
Well, obviously my Twitter handle is Wine Matters, and I do write for many publications here and overseas, but, Wine Searcher, Halliday Magazine, a few others, but they can also email me, janefalkner@winematters.com.au if you're nice. And and I'm around, on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way directly, but there you go.
Well,
Thank you.
fantastic.
Been
Thank
fun.
you.
Lots of fun.
It has been wonderful. Thank you. And thank you, Vincasters, for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. And if you did enjoy this week's episode of the podcast with Jane Faulkner, then please do send us some feedback on Twitter and Instagram. You can find me at Intrepid Wino, and you can also follow the podcast on Twitter at the Vincast. Why not share your impressions of the podcast on Facebook? You can like my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Intrepid Wino. And I would love for you to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or any other form of podcast sharing app. If you do subscribe, you get the latest episode as soon as it becomes available, and it would be much appreciated if you could leave a 5-star rating and write a review, which is great feedback for potential listeners and, more importantly, potential guests that you might like to hear their story. All that information is available at intrepidwino.com, as well as lots of different writings that I've done in the past, and the aforementioned YouTube channel and videos as well. Look forward to having many more wonderful guests on the podcast, but until then, bye.